I'm Hannah Jo, and I am the guest interviewer at the District House. And tonight I'm here with Andy Clark. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I want to offer a quick intro to District216 because I know we have at least one new friend tonight. So District216 is a membership-based psychedelic social club. And week to week, we have these awesome events on Wednesday nights. And sometimes it's a guest interview. Other times it's a film screening or a roundtable conversation, but always in these themes of music, art, cannabis, and psychedelics. So I appreciate you all coming out tonight. We're going to share an interesting conversation all about Andy, what he's passionate about, meaning making, archetypes, the medicine space, and integration. So let's dive into that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Do you want to paint a picture a little bit about, I always like to hear what your past life was before you came into the medicine space, and if there was any like pivotal moment that brought you into that realm.
Sure. Well, I've spent the last 23 years as an artist working in animation. So before I got into the medicine space, which kind of feels like it's always been with me, I was working in corporate entertainment for people like Disney and Warner Brothers and Nickelodeon and developing content for kids' TV. Wow. Yeah. So I guess as far as a pivotal moment goes, that would have been probably 2009 for me. I lost my job. I had a health crisis. I lost my marriage. Pretty much everything was kind of pulled out from under me, and it was sort of like a dark night of the soul or catharsis. And I went down to the Amazon to search for meaning, and met my teacher down there.
Yeah. Wow. That sounds so huge.
Yeah, it all kind of transpired rather quickly, actually. Mm-hmm. I was talking to one of my family members on the phone, kind of determining like what my next steps should be, whether I should stay in the relationship or what. And it was my sister, and she said, "Well, no matter what, if you stay or you go, just go find your pieces." And that was her way of saying, just go on the path, and it will start to present itself. And I said, "Well, what do you think I should do?" And she said, "Well, you like holotropic breath work. Maybe you should go look into that." And so I was Googling holotropic breath work when I came across Stan Groff teaching a workshop on my birthday at the LA Marriott. And I thought, well, that's a sign. So I went to go do that and had an amazing experience with the holotropic breath work, and met a young man from Poland who was starting to talk to me about ayahuasca. And I thought, I need to meet with this guy and have a conversation. So I went home and was going through my emails, and I had my first invitation to a ceremony that night. So within a weekend, it seemed like a lot of these answers were being illuminated for me. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. And for some reason, I feel kind of like tickled knowing that you had this past life profession in animation. And I wonder, did you feel connected to meaning in that period of your life when you were doing that professionally?
Honestly, no. I mean, I knew I wanted to be an artist from when I was a kid, but I felt during that period of time just kind of like a cog in the wheel. I kind of felt like a monkey in a cubicle, and was not really feeling fulfilled, and a little bit overwhelmed by all of the Y2K things and everything that was happening at the early part of the 2000s. So I think that was a part of maybe my reanimation.
Yeah, I love that. And I celebrate that for you.
Oh, thank you.
When did fulfillment come?
Well, I think that probably came from, I would say, either the first or second ayahuasca experience that I had when I went down to the Amazon, where some of these sort of repressed memories that I had from a child, I had experienced a couple of significant illnesses, and in those periods of illness, like I kind of received some downloads that were a little bit weird and odd, and I had to sort of suppress those memories. And so when I went down to the Amazon to do my first ayahuasca session, those memories came back. And it became really clear that this was the direction that I needed to go into. It had always been with me since I was a kid, sometimes suppressed and held back because I didn't really know how to process the information or make sense of what was happening, making the meaning of what was happening. But in those sessions, I kind of describe it as opening up a filing cabinet and seeing all the different files or the different places of your life all being completed and making sense in that one moment. Like, this had to happen so that this could happen so that you could meet this person. And when I had that awareness, it all made sense that this was going to be my path.
That's super powerful, and I'm grateful for you to share that with us.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you can share with the audience and share with myself your current framework on things like having really intense illness, or that experience of repression or suppression of receiving intuitive hits.
Help me out a little bit further. Can you deepen into the question a little bit?
Yeah. From what you've shared so far, I'm receiving that you find these things valuable even when they're not easy. And things like illness are sometimes hard to see in a spiritual perspective.
Right. I think that's a really, really powerful context and point of view to have, in that all of the challenges that I've ever experienced in my life, including these illnesses, all bear some gift. And it was in the awareness that those gifts were evident that I could start to pass through the challenges and the illnesses with a little more ease, because I knew that if I was aware, I could start to find that meaning in the gifts and that they could become teachers to me. Yeah.
Amazing. So I want to better understand how meaning making really hit you. And was it from those first few ayahuasca sits, or was it a particular container or process you had in community?
I think it was an ongoing process. I mean, I was kind of deep into my own work and process with my teacher before I became a facilitator. But I think once I became a facilitator, I started to see kind of how my clients and people were moving through their stories and their narratives that they had created, whether those were around traumas or not. And that I could see those stories within myself, those narratives, and that I actually had a choice in the narratives that I created. And that's where things really lit up for me, and it became really exciting because I was able to kind of get out of my own way to see those meanings that I had created in my life. Some of them were not even true. They were totally made up from a child's perspective. And to see that as an adult and realize, oh, I actually have agency in the stories that I choose to have, the meanings that I derive from those stories, and how that affects how I move through the world.
Are you open to sharing one of those stories that was untrue in the larger sense, but true in the sense that it was within you? If you're open to recalling one to share with us.
Yeah, the one that it just is the go-to one is a little dramatic. I mean, I experienced a little bit of emotional abuse from my mom, not so much physical abuse, but some. She was a little heavy-handed. But one of the events that I had constructed in my mind was that my mom had beaten me to the point where I was trying to crawl underneath the toilet to get away from her. Now, that was a total story that I made up in my head. That never happened. But in the moment of whatever trauma I was going through that was related to my mom and my experience with her got created. And then that became a story that I literally brought with me throughout my life until I woke up and realized that it wasn't even true. I had made it up. And that was really shocking. It's like, well, what else have I made up? Right? And so there was a process of accounting, like I really had to kind of go through and sort of do that introspective work to see where these stories were getting created. Were they mine or were they somebody else's stories? Right? And I think that that's what's so powerful about the concept of meaning making, is that we we are storytellers at our roots. We make meaning in what happens throughout our lives, and we have agency in those stories that we create. They can be teachers and healers, or they can help keep us sort of in lack, and kind of dumbing us down.
And I wonder, what did you do in that moment of questioning, oh, if I was running that story and that wasn't rooted in truth, what else?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I can bring up anything in my mind right now that I can remember, but I can tell you that it was an overall feeling of like, I need to reevaluate what I believe on an overall level. Because I could recognize that the chatterer voice in my head was not just my voice. It was somebody else's. It was my mom's, it was my father's, it was my church, it was the school, it was my Uncle John. In the early days, well, I thought, oh, that was just me. But it wasn't. And that was the beginning part of starting to unravel that.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and for myself on my personal path, very relatable. And I'll share, I had a similar recognition kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum, where I was maybe 18 or 19 years old, and I was going to school at UCSB, and I was walking on the beach, and in relationship to everything I was learning academically, I had the acknowledgement that my mom was not the smartest person in the world. And no one had asked that of me to run that story. She especially didn't.
Right.
And what I found in that moment of recognition was similar to you. Oh, this calls for a whole reevaluation. And I had a lot of grief to release around that.
Yeah.
Because there was a sense of sadness that I had been living in an illusion. And so I'm curious if you felt like any particular emotion and how you moved that energy around these recognitions.
Sure. I think the first one is shame. Shame is what came up. I just felt ashamed that I had made up this story. My poor mother, who did the best that she could from where she was at, didn't deserve that. And so I felt a lot of shame around that. So I really had to go through a period of forgiveness of myself and my mother for doing the best that she could.
And I imagine you were with medicine in that practice of forgiveness in moments?
No, I wasn't. No,
Yeah.
This was my early 20s.
Wow.
Yeah,
Powerful.
before I got to medicine, yeah.
Yeah. So in the medicine space you found yourself in the Amazon, you were primarily with ayahuasca, and that was a huge catalyst for you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, mostly ayahuasca.
Would you like to share more about where that led you on this trajectory of becoming a facilitator and space holder?
Sure. Well, I think I kind of touched on it a second ago. I think in the early sessions that I had with this sort of reemergence of these past memories that had, this had always been with me. That sense of knowingness had a deep resonation of truth for me. And so the path was very, very clear. There was no doubt in my mind that this is where I needed to be. I needed to go through losing my job, losing my family, my house, in order to get to this place. And somebody once told me that God does not call the qualified, God qualifies the called. And so I think that's, part of the good news for us is that when we go through deep challenges, that there is this gift that we can glean from the events that can actually set us on our paths. Yeah.
Totally. I appreciate that notion. And similarly with the personal agency piece, it can be overwhelming, and it can also be bite-sized and a moment-to-moment remembrance of our choice that we can exercise.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear from you if you're open to going in this direction with me, the way you share yourself today and what projects or types of service are inspiring you and how you support others in their meaning-making and personal agency development.
Sure. Well, I think, I mean, all of this is, what I'm doing is, guiding people through experiences. And the meaning making process is a big part of that. And, it first starts with awareness that you actually are creating stories and narratives, and then taking responsibility for those and kind of cleaning up your side of the street. And then the exciting part of it is, well, what do you want to create? Knowing that you're a creator, and the meaning that you create, I believe, actually goes out into, they call it the semiosphere. So, the meaning making is not a school. It's a combination of many, many schools: psychology, anthropology, literary theory. Within the last couple of years, a lot of scientific information is coming out about how neurology is wired based on what we think about. And so when you start thinking of, well, I'm creating meaning around something, your neurology is literally wiring to match that. And then you're going out into the world with this emotional backpack with all of these meanings that you've created, some of which you don't even know about. So you don't even know that you don't know. We call those blind spots. And then you wake up to those blind spots and you go, oh, I've got to clean up my side of the street a little bit. That's not even my story. Right?
Yeah, I feel like what you were describing is sort of the multidisciplinary vision of what it is to make meaning.
Yeah.
And for some reason, what was coming to me is like our evolution, like our evolutionary biology has also made us make meaning of things.
Yeah. Well, and then there's the process of going beyond meaning making. And what does that look like? And is that a space? And that is a space. That not everything has to mean something. And so in a lot of the psychedelic work that I do, people have experiences and they're like, oh, well, this means this and that means that. And I say, well, that's great, but realize as soon as you say that's what it is, then that's what it becomes. And then your neurology matches. So my recommendation is to kind of pull back and open your perspective and watch to see how the meaning evolves. Because meaning continues to evolve as we change and we grow. The meaning that we're creating also evolves and grows. And if we jump to it too quickly, then we'll miss those sort of signposts in our development that would be there to give us a deeper version of what's happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what I'm receiving from that is that you suggest a flexibility with the meanings that people create or language.
Yeah.
And you're saying that rather than limiting to perhaps your initial meaning, holding that with curiosity and interest, but being open to it unfurling in its own time.
Yeah, that's the unfolding of it. The number one cause of quote unquote failed journeys or bad experience is neurosis or rigid thinking.
Whoa.
Right. And in my experience, I've actually seen people's thinking limit the ability of the medicine to actually be effective. It can totally get in the way. And so the mind is a really, really powerful organism for creation. And so developing that plasticity in your thinking to be more open, to see how things evolve and develop, and sometimes not jump in to make meaning out of something. Some things just are, and that is also a part of going beyond meaning, is accepting ambiguity, accepting the mystery, accepting the unknown, and not like trying to pin it down and say, well, this is what it means, right? Yeah.
This is super relevant for me on my journey. I am being deeply initiated into a practice of accepting that I don't understand everything. And I really want to, and I accept that I don't. And I wanted to visit again your definition of self-responsibility, because you're describing when you come into awareness that you're a creator, it's important to be mindful of that creation, because a lot of it happens in the unconscious mind. And so the more we can bring into consciousness, the more powerfully we can create. So I'd love for you to describe through an example or through a description of what self-responsibility in relationship to creation really is.
I'll do my best. I think personal agency is and accountability are number one. To really have a sense of integrity means having a sense of wholeness, and so developing practices and ways of moving through the world that actually work on the subconscious mind, so that during your waking states, you're not run by it. Right, it's sort of like the quieter you get, the more that you hear consciousness talking back to you. But if you're not sort of in those methods of practices of working on the subconscious mind and what's moving forward, it can become like the monkey mind or chatter that can fill your day with just garbage. So, yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
I wasn't like looking for anything in particular on that. And I thought that I never am, just following the creative pathway flow. But I appreciate that. And what I received is that as we create practices that we revisit in a consistent way, we're able to create space around the words within the mind to develop a discernment of something that is rooted in truth and supportive thoughts versus things that are maybe created within ourselves to protect ourselves from feeling something that we wouldn't necessarily prefer, but that there's a learning to either integrate an aspect or make a subtle adjustment to lead us on a pathway that is of higher preference.
Yeah, so I think defaulting to those more general feelings of well-being that arrive, and not listening to a lot of the chatter. My teacher says, don't believe everything that you think, and when doubt arises, doubt the doubt.
Something else that I've heard you mention before that you value is play and lightheartedness.
Yeah.
How does that tie into this topic?
Well, I think play is underrated. I think that as children, we accept play as a natural part of how we express ourselves in the world. And there's something that happens to us as adults, the domestication of us, or we get sidetracked with other ideas that we forget about playfulness. And the thing about playfulness is that you can't be playful if you're stressed. You have to feel safe to be able to play. And so, the idea that you go into things like medicine work with the purpose of personal development can be a lot of weight on a person's shoulders. Like you're searching for something and you've got a level of tenacity about wanting those answers or I need to know, right? And that can create a lot of pressure, right? That worry, doubt sort of energy. And taking that and flipping it on its head and being playful with it and being curious about it allows more room, right, for the possibility to exist. Again, I think if you go into it with a certain expectation of it has to be like this, and it's like conjuring up your perfect mate. Oh, they need to look like this, they need to be like this, all of these checks and balances. Well, you've just sort of put the blinders on and you've told consciousness to just operate within these parameters. Well, you've just limited your ability of like the field, right? And I use Mick Jagger's quote a lot. It's like you don't always get what you want, but you get what you need, and there's some kind of divinity in that, I think. And if we can kind of step back a little bit and create more space and be a little bit more playful in the way that we go about how we move through the world, particularly around the way we create meaning, it can create a levity and a pleasure about it, and not a heaviness of I've got to do this and I've got to overcome this, and this is like a drudgery thing. You can already feel how the energy kind of will start to weigh you down with responsibilities or expectations.
Or a feeling of needing fixing, which isn't helpful.
Yeah, I don't think that we need fixing. I think it's more about remembering.
And so how can people hearing this conversation remember to play? If they feel disconnected from play, do you have any points that you can suggest to reconnect to that vibration?
Yeah, get into nature. get back, get your feet into the ground, go for a hike, go for a walk, go move your body. The body is a great reservoir of information and energy. And if we tune into the body, it will reveal our secrets to us. So, remembering to dance, remembering to, take in the simple pleasures of a sunset, or watching the moon rise, or going for a walk with a friend, is really, really important. And I think for each one of us is going to be a little bit different, and that's part of the excitement, is that it's going to be different for everybody. So I tell people, think of it like you're planning your own party. And so what's your party look like? I don't know. Who's coming to your party? What does it look like? And when you start to really make that investment into what you're creating, you're kind of preparing the ground before its arrival, right?
Yeah. And it's my guess that at your party, it's full of people who are really connected to their playfulness and also really connected to nature. Because I've heard you say that really supports you in your integration of your medicine experiences.
Yeah. I think being in nature is really, really powerful. But I also want to go back and say that planning the party is not just about all the feel-good things, right? Planning the party is also about integrating those pieces of us that are a little sticky and a little edgy. And so the party has to include all of those pieces, not just the fun parts, right? Not just playfulness, but that is definitely a part of it. Yeah.
I think that is really important in any spiritual or personal development work, that we don't exclude those aspects that are a little bit harder to see. And I know earlier you talked about blind spots, and I imagine in your work, in the ways that you do, you support an expanded awareness around where people may be blind to things that they're creating.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you want to lead us into any conversation around archetypes in the subconscious and unconscious mind.
Sure. So the way that it's been explained to me by the shamans in the Amazon is that the plants communicate with us through the use of archetypes, symbols, and metaphor. It's not an intellectual process. It's more of a felt process. And the reason why is because in their tradition, it's a storyteller tradition, a verbal tradition. So the shaman would tell the story, and then the receiver would relate to the story in a very personal way. They would find the story within themselves. And so when you make that connection, there's a knowingness within the story. And so that's kind of the point, right? As we want to develop that connection for ourselves, and archetype and metaphor are huge players in the field of development. Now, if you're familiar with things like a yantra, do you know what a yantra is? Like the sort of representation of the physical aspect of a design. Well, that design actually contains information like a metaphor does. A metaphor is just a symbol for a lot of data, right? And some of that data is subjective, meaning individual, and some of that data is objective, meaning universal. So there's universal metaphors that are cross-cultural in people like Joseph Campbell's work. You'll see that. And so there's this interplay of subjective and objective experience in a sort of a feedback loop as we relate into these stories through the medicine experiences personally, and we dive into what those meanings are for us, both subjectively and how it plays out into the world objectively.
I totally appreciate that, high level painting of the picture of archetypes and metaphor. And just in the instance that someone listening to this conversation doesn't know what an archetype is, can you define that either through your personal lens or what you've learned from your teachers?
Well, so an archetype could be like the hero, All right, we all know what a hero is. Whatever culture you come from, we understand what a hero is. So that's an archetype. It represents a certain message or symbology to the person who's receiving it, right? And that can be incredibly powerful, and especially on how we internalize that messaging through these expanded states of consciousness. They could literally take us on a whole new direction in our life just simply by contemplating this new information. It can cause a crisis of identity, meaning your whole world comes up against this new idea because it doesn't make sense anymore, because all the meaning that you've created up until this point doesn't fly anymore. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the hero is a great example that many people can connect to. And I will share that I feel in a personal journey, archetypally transitioning from the common feminine archetype of maiden into the archetype of mother.
Right.
And there's many ways that that shows up for me, but I feel in a chapter of really embracing my womanhood and honoring myself in a new and mindful way that feels very connected to my body and connected to the earth.
Yeah.
And so I relate to archetypes personally in that way. And I wonder if there's any personal share you have on a archetype that feels resonant for you, either in this stage of your life or that has been memorable.
I don't know that I can pull anything out of my hat right now, but I would say, the indigenous cultures, or their whole cosmology works off of this idea of animus, or that everything is alive, that there's nothing that doesn't have a sense of aliveness in it. And so when it comes to metaphor, so to them the streams are a metaphor, the mountains are a metaphor, the sky is a metaphor. And this is why indigenous cultures don't need integration after medicine journeys, by the way, because they experience this sense of connection with the meaning that their environment is providing to them, and it's been with them for a very long time. So I think for me, it's a really rich playground in which I get to sort of exercise not only my own healing, but also creativity by exploring these different archetypes. So an example would be like if I'm having a challenging time, I might conjure up an archetype to support me. I would say, what would Batman do? Batman's an archetype, right? The Dark Knight, right? What would this character do? Like, how would they behave in a situation? What would Jesus do? Jesus is an archetype, an avatar. And so, again, going back to the idea of the school of meaning making, which is called the semiosphere, which is kind of like this quantum field of symbology and information. And we have access to that semiosphere in which to pull down things that will support us on our journey. So if you're on your journey and you're struggling, it's like you might pull up the mother archetype. Like, what would the mother do in this case? From a male perspective, and we talk about the warrior from the male perspective, it's like, well, how would the warrior mother himself? So what does the mother archetype look like for a warrior? So you start to kind of internalize those messages and see what resonates. And then if something sticks, well, then maybe that becomes something that you actuate in your life. That becomes a practice, or it becomes a ritual.
And I see where cultivating a body connection would really support this practice of connecting to archetypes, because when I hear you just pose the question of, how would the warrior relate to mother? To me, I hear compassion.
Yeah.
But in my perspective, that it's essential to have a connection to the felt experience to be able to feel compassion in a way that is sustainable and something you can call upon in any moment that you remember it's available.
Right. And again, I think it starts with awareness, because I don't think that, at least in our culture, it's really promoted for men to be in their feelings, right? And so that's a very vulnerable place for us to go, But I think it's also part of our are learning as well as people. And again, the plants are here to show us this method of like, these ideas are ways of navigating and moving through the world with purpose and creating meaning as you're going, knowing that it's going to constantly evolve, right?
Totally. And I want to honor and acknowledge you as a male body on this pathway of embracing the full spectrum of your emotional range. And I feel that our culture is very rigid in these ideas of, if you're in this body, you can only feel this degree of emotion. If you're in this body, that degree of emotion is too much. And so I honor you in all that you've done to rework those stories, and to reclaim your humanity and your innocence in all that you feel.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
And I know you have a little memory exercise that you're wanting to lead the audience through, but before we get into that, is there anything else that you would like to share or offer us?
Well, no, I'm complete. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, beautiful. I'd love for you to lead us through this guided practice, and then we can share some reflections on that. I have a couple rapid fire questions for you.
Okay.
And then we'll shift gears to audience Q&A.
Okay. So if you want to participate in this, you can. So this is an exercise for creating ways of pivoting out of dense, dark feelings or emotions. So we all have experienced, places within our minds that are overwhelming and can kind of be a trigger for us. And what I work with clients is how to pivot those emotions so that we can kind of guide ourselves off the ledge and get back into a state of well-being. Because from my perspective, well-being, when we're in a state of well-being, we're actually in our higher self and directly in connection with consciousness, and thereby having access to this semiosphere of information that we can then use and actualize in our life. So if you want, close your eyes and just take a second to feel your breath. And so now I want you to use your imagination to go back into a place in your life when you were a child. And when you go back to this place has deep, rich feeling of juicy goodness when you think about it. So when you think about this place, it just feels good to be there. And so now, become aware that you're in that place. That you actually just shifted your focus, and now you are in a totally different place of well-being than you were 2 seconds ago. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Mic drop. So it's a very, very simple exercise, but it's really, really powerful. And if you're familiar with law of attraction, which this sort of comes out of, the idea is that if you can hold a thought of well-being for 17 seconds, another thought of well-being will come in. And if you hold that for 17 seconds, another one will come in. And you can get the idea that if you're able to hold your focus on that feeling of goodness, you will literally walk yourself away off the ledge of those denser, darker feelings or emotions. And it's just a thought away. Your brain doesn't know the difference between something that's real, a real memory, and your imagination. It doesn't know the difference. It just recognizes the state of feeling that you're in. You feel happy, you feel sad, right? That's it. Super simple.
I'm curious to receive just a show of hands from the audience. Did you all have access to a memory that maybe became visual for you? Is there something you saw? I noticed it became visual for me. And almost as I focused more on the details of that memory, I was able to further feel into the well-being and the lightheartedness and the friendship that was present for me.
That's
in that
really,
memory.
really key. That's really key. That's back to planning your party. So when we go back to these memories, the more that you can notice the sort of nuances of this place, the textures, the smell, who's there with you, what are they doing? How are people reacting and behaving in this delicious space? Even if it's just you and your cat, right? So for me, what I try to do is I have about 5 of these go-to memories that I just keep in my back pocket. And if I experience a challenging day or somebody cuts me off in traffic and I'm just not my best self, I will pick up one of these memories and I'll just recycle it through my mind. And every time I do it, it feels good. And I just literally walk myself off the edge of the cliff every time.
That's powerful. And so maybe tonight I myself will go home and note 5 potent memories, and that's a encouragement for anyone else to do the same, so we all are resourced with those feel-good memories when we need them.
Yeah, let's do some homework. Write down 5 go-to good memories.
Mm-hmm. And feel welcome to share yours with myself or Andy after our chat as well.
Yeah, great.
Well, I'd love to ask you a few more questions
Sure.
before I hand it off to the audience.
Great.
And you've heard these ones before, so maybe I'll mix up the order a bit. We heard from you a bit about a powerful ayahuasca experience you had. Is there another potent medicine memory that you would like to share?
Yeah, so I was in the Amazon about a year and a half ago to doing some master plant work. And for those who don't know what master plant work is, that there's a whole pharmacology of supportive plants that are used with ayahuasca. And this is a process that, I mean, for me, lasted 26 days in isolation using these plants. And so a plant called bobansana, which is used in conjunction with ayahuasca, that as it is, works on your subconscious. They consider it a very feminine plant. And what I found, and it's not something, when you drink it, because it's made as a brew, you don't go into an altered state of consciousness when you drink it. What happens is when you go to sleep, it starts to actuate into your subconscious mind. So your dream time is really, really intense. And so every significant woman in my life arrived in my dreams, sometimes all together, like all of them together, or significant ones in different contexts. But that was quite something. Yeah.
I've never heard of that before. That's very
bobansana.
curious to me.
Yeah, very powerful plant.
Yeah. And my next question for you is, in your framework, do you believe there to be an afterlife? And has your experience with medicine given you any glimpses to what that may be?
I'm absolutely convinced that there is. I don't pretend to understand what it looks like. But my guess is it's just like love, and it's just kind of a recycling of that energy into different forms and shapes and expressions.
Totally. Appreciate your flexibility around the not knowingness.
Yeah.
Yeah. And who has been your greatest influence and why?
Alive or dead?
You choose.
I get to choose. Gosh, so many teachers. Paramahansa Yogananda, I think, is probably up there. I mean, there's quite a few, but Herman Hesse, Siddhartha, I read probably once a year. It's a pretty powerful book for me. Yeah.
And what about Yogananda is influential to you?
Well, I guess it's the mindfulness and utter compassion. Developing a compassionate practice, not only for yourself, but for the world. It's like we're all just trying to do the best that we can from where we're at. Nobody's purposely some people are not good people, but I think generally people are generally doing the best that they can from where they're at. You know,
it's an important thing to recognize.
Yeah.
And for yourself, that you're doing the best you can
I'm doing
too.
the same thing. It's like I'm just doing the best I can from where I'm at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And dead or alive, who would you sit in ceremony with, and with what medicine?
Wow. Probably Jesus. I mean, my one theory is that the bread that they ate at the Last Supper had mold from psilocybin spores on it. So I don't know, maybe they were all loaded at the Last Supper already. I don't know. But I would journey with Jesus for sure.
On the psilocybin mold bread, or?
No, I think I would get more creative with that. We would layer it through the evening. It would be quite the experience. Yes.
Me and Jacob are there.
I mean, I think there would be some ecstatic dance involved. And
yeah, lots of play.
Yes, definitely. Playing with Jesus.
Beautiful. And I'm going to finish with this one because it's curious to me. Do you think that we live in a simulation? And if your answer is yes or maybe, can you define that context?
Well, I guess it depends on what your definition of simulation is. I think that there is a field of consciousness that's alive and awake that we are interacting with and playing with and creating with. And in that, we are creating different matrices and simulations within that as another form of it to see itself. Yeah.
Totally. I resonate with that. And to me, that is it.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this chat, Andy.
Yeah,
I
my pleasure.
appreciate getting to know you more deeply through this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
I would love to open to the audience. If anyone has any questions that they're with, we can offer them to Andy now, and myself or a fellow helper will offer you the mic.
What's happening in my brain is I'm trying to angle this conversation, the takeaways of this conversation towards my personal experience and where I'm at in this moment. And so the main question's for Andy, but there's a sub question for Hannah if you want to speak to it. Andy, you talked about this neurology that forms when we wake meaning, and as I think about my life, from the time I'm a little kid, I mean, even before sort of verbal, but especially once the verbal started, it's we have thoughts and neurons fire and neuropeptides are released that go to neural plexuses where there's genes and glands that release chemicals and emotions equivalent to this thought. So this sort of web, this neurophysiology web starts forming at a really young age, and we just kind of start stacking onto it moment by moment, day by day, week by week, and it really starts to build, right? Become these really thick sort of layers, and I don't have access to a lot of those layers, right? The majority of them are just, by definition, I don't have access to it in my conscious state because they're stored in the cerebellum and amygdala and all of these subconscious parts of the brain. And as stimulus sort of hits it, right? It hits that part of the brain first before it even gets to my prefrontal cortex a lot of the time, to where then my body's producing emotions based on those past meanings, and then eventually it gets to my prefrontal cortex. And so it seems like there's a lot of potential for creating agency through illuminating those layers, or shifting those layers, or shifting your own sort of neurophysiology beyond your past, right? Beyond all of these past layers that have just accumulated. And then on top of all that, we're it's not just the thoughts and emotions, we are making meaning as we do it too, right? We're making things up. And so my sub question to Hannah was you mentioned this evolutionary biology, driver towards meaning. And I'm just curious, like, to elaborate about like where did that come from? What are your thoughts of like why did we develop this evolutionary driver to create this meaning? And then like the question for Andy is like, so given that this is just one way of trying to describe what's happening in my mind, and I'm sure it's off in some ways, maybe it's off in all the ways. What's your advice on like where to go from here? Like, there's a lot of things I can do, right? There's a lot of substances that'll put me in a transluminal state and start to open the door to those different layers. I could read some Carl Jung books and do some dream journaling. I could go to therapy. I could do some somatic work. Yeah, I mean, there's so many different avenues, and I've tried a good amount of them, and I enjoy it. Yeah. But I just like from where you're at, like, and you know me a little bit, like, what do you think?
Well, a couple of things. I was just mentioning this to somebody else earlier today. It's like, I think that we have to be careful that we're not multitasking our transformation, if you understand my meaning. That, we can get a little bit on the bandwagon of going out and doing more to understand more. And while that's okay, it does have its limitations. And so, when I hear you speak about it, to me, what comes to my mind is like grooves in a record, right? We're pattern recognizers and makers. And so like in our early development, it's like, I go to this person and she feeds me from her breast. And when I do, I feel good. And so that peptide gets released in the chemical and all of that happens in our early development. And then there's, the lack thereof, right? What does that mean? It's like, somebody might say, well, women aren't safe. And then you take that into the world. It's like, I don't feel safe. So, I mean, to kind of get back to your question, I would just say, be really easy about it. Go back to play. And there's actually been a lot of information that's come out recently about how the meaning is actually created. It's less about a chemical response and more almost as sort of like a spooky thing at a distance, sort of quantum thing, that things are, there's actually something that's happening beyond or before those chemical responses are actually triggered. And some of the experiments that were done where people were like put in front of a computer monitor and they were supposed to guess the image that was going to be projected on the screen. And you'd be surprised on how many got them right. Because there's like a luminous space or a numinous space that I kind of equate to as the quantum, where all of this information is available. And I think when we sort of restrict our ability to kind of be open to that magic, we can kind of get in our own way. So I would say go back to play and be easy about it. Like you're exactly where you need to be. There's no other place that you need to be except for where you are. And so be easy about it.
I'd love to respond to both pieces of your ask, if I have permission to do so. Yeah. So I mentioned the evolutionary biology piece because in my concept, in our earlier times existing on this planet in whatever way we did, less meaning was required to survive. And that was just my immediate thought that arose in that moment. But separate of that perspective and personally speaking, I think we're gifted this human experience on this planet to come to a greater spiritual awakening. So to me, the evolutionary biology piece is less of a personal interest, but something that I still expose myself to and a perspective that I find valuable in the right regard. But for myself, I am more interested in how I can access my own inspiration, which is what I perceive to be the spirit within myself. And so I feel like in your ask of what to do, there's so many options. I would encourage, similarly to Andy, to connect, to play, to find resonance of inspiration, and to follow what you feel inspired to pursue. And some of us may feel disconnected from that, and that's okay. That's where your point of embracing and accepting yourself exactly where you're at will, in my perspective, always be a medicine that's available. And there's layers and depth to the practice and cultivation of self-acceptance that are beyond anything I can describe. There's, in my experience, always more to uncover and receive yourself in. And as you feel inspired to try something new, a substance, a mirror, an opportunity to be with yourself in a new way, I encourage that. And you will never choose wrong, in my opinion.
If I can go one step further, too, is that in Quechua they say el viaje engaño, pero el engaño está la persona, no en el viaje. The translation is the medicine will trick you, but the trick is in the person first. So it's not about the medicine. It's not about the yoga. It's not about the Carl Jung. It's not about any pursuit that's outside of you. The medicine is just pointing you back to the fact that you're the medicine. And so embodying that, those values, right? Senses of integrity, loyalty, trust, the basics, and embodying those into the world. Because, the last thing we want to do with the psychedelic renaissance is just kind of go back to replacing something outside of us as the answer. It's not shopping or pornography or substances. It's just, I think part of the evolution is that we're becoming aware of, out of our evolutionary biology, are things like negative bias, which is a biological part of our evolution. As humans, we're programmed to look for problems. That's the way we're wired. But the whole problem with that scenario is that you're always in the problem. And in order to solve a problem, you can't be in the problem. You have to be in the solution. So you have to switch your mindset into not recognizing that you're in a problem, but that you're actually in a solution. And then the solution just presents itself.
I want to respond. I want to say about 5 things, and I hope they don't all clog my mind so I can't say anything. That happens.
We'll roll with it, Shirley.
When you just first now started talking, it reminded me of a definition, the definition actually of education, which is bringing forth, right? Rather than filling up, which our schools tend to do, we should be bringing forth.
Yeah. I was going to just, so the guy who came up, the first quotes of meaning making in literature comes from a guy named Robert Keegan, who was a psychologist whose main focus was education.
As is mine. As is all of ours, really. And the other thing, one of the other things I wanted to say is that today and other times when I've spoken to you or listened to you talk about your ideas and your philosophy and your experience, you always come from inside yourself. This is what I experienced from you, that you come from inside yourself, not just from your experience, but also you're there, you're present, and you're coming from inside yourself. And I think that's why it allows me, it activates, I follow along with what you're saying, and then something in me adds something. And then you continue to talk, and I go, oh yeah, so I'll add that in, which then brings me to another thought that comes from my own head.
See how delicious that can become?
It is wonderful. I'm having this whole conversation with
and
you.
So we give that to ourselves. Like when we do that in community, it's like that's why I say it's like we are the medicine.
We are the people that we're waiting for.
Exactly.
So when you can dive into that space and you can find the person's narrative and story and let that kind of wash over you, not that you have to accept everybody's narrative, but if anything lands for you or if anything triggers you, those are two big indications that you need to take a look at that, especially if it triggers you. If you're like, oh, I don't like that. Well, so what about that inside of you? Because that's a moment of learning and teaching for you.
Well, yes, okay.
Yeah.
It just brings up a lot of my own thoughts, and
Yeah,
appreciate
sure.
that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you tell us about a compound that we don't know anything about, please?
Yeah, I can tell you about 19 that
I know.
you don't know about.
Pick a couple.
Yeah, so in the practice that I've been initiated into, the shaman is from the Peruvian Amazon, but he embraces all indigenous cultures underneath one system, using the Native American medicine wheel. And the wheel has 4 points or 4 directions in there: heart, mind, body, and spirit. And so every indigenous tradition has a plant medicine tradition. Most of them have visionary plant medicine traditions. So there's several things in your kitchen. Things like black pepper is a psychotropic. So is lavender. So is mistletoe. So is acacia. I mean, the list goes on. Nutmeg. So there's quite, I've heard it described that the pharmacology is in the tens of thousands. It's a lot. And some that have yet to be discovered that are still being practiced by, remote tribes in places like Africa and South America and the Amazon. But the interesting thing is that, so we talk about empathogens, and an empathogen is something that promotes sort of a heart-centered experience. So these plants have characteristics that are like metaphor and archetype. So some of the plants are what we call teacher plants, and some are ally plants. So some are here to kind of grab you by the ear and say, come here, I'm going to show you something. You need to pay attention, sort of like grandma. Or other plants that are kind of more soft and cuddly that are like, oh, it's going to be okay. Well, So the point being that plants are sentient and they have certain characteristics. And so when we understand those characteristics, predominantly through an indigenous perspective or lens, then we can use those in ceremonies to help facilitate and support people's healing or development.
Yeah, so curious on your suggestions on how we approach medicine work and to kind of set a stage for the question. Like these substances are pretty powerful, like very powerful, and I think a lot of people have argued that as much power as they have to do good, they have to I don't want to say not do good, but as much power as they have to help people have insight, clarity, resolution, they can also cause distress and bring stuff up that people don't know how to deal with and
Sure.
and not be helpful. And similarly as like the medicine by a doctor, right? Like these SSRIs, like they can do great to help you start functioning, and they can have horrible fucking side effects.
Mm-hmm.
And so and then the more powerful, right, these substances, the higher the dose, right, the more of this, I guess, this neurology that you have that can be exposed. And when we don't have a lot of tools, right, to know how to work with it, and we don't even know that we don't have the tools to know how to work with it,
Yeah.
it seems like one, it limits the ability to use these substances in really beneficial ways, and two, like it kind of makes sense why a lot of people can kind of get into trouble with them and either then not use them or become reliant on them.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question is just what recommendations do you have for approaching these substances and working with them in our lives?
Well, I think do your research, do your due diligence. I mean, you're developing personal agency and responsibility for your own healing and development. So go out and do your research. Find a good guide, somebody who's really reputable. Find a place that has great reputation. And then, things like integration and aftercare. Medicine work is not for everybody. Everybody is not for medicine work. That doesn't mean it's always the case. It means that maybe in this moment, you need to be doing something else in preparation for doing that. And then for some people, particularly people with mental illness, it's not recommended. Does that answer your question, or was it a little bit deeper than that?
Yeah, I guess I think that those recommendations sound like sort of high level, structurally very sound. And then, yeah, I'm curious if you want to go a layer deeper or two.
Sure. So, actually, in my experience, the deeper, more advanced work is done with less medicine. It's actually more of like, how subtle can you get? How soft? How much can you allow? How much can you surrender? How much can you open? How much can you get out of your own way? Not give me more so I don't have to show up. The medicine's going to tool me and take me for a ride, or I'm going to depend on the medicine to show me something. That's a little bit of an egotistical statement, in my opinion. And I wouldn't want to surrender myself to anything else outside of me anyway. Why would I turn myself over to this plant to just do whatever it wanted? There's no agency in that. It's a relationship. And that relationship is not, it's like inviting a friend over. And you're just like, okay, you're in charge. You take over. It's like, you would never do that. You'd be like, okay, we're going to do this together. Right? And so, I was in that place as well. When I first started, I was all about the journey work and couldn't stop doing it and needed more and more and more and more. And then, my teacher reminded me of that phrase. And it's a powerful one because it really shines the light on where the rubber meets the road, and it's within us. It's a remembering, right? Not a remembering. It's not intellectual. It's not this chemical does this thing and then this psychological process does this thing. It's not about that. It's a knowingness that you have to feel for yourself. Transformation is not borrowed from somebody or something. You have to experience it on your level where you are at. And if your level is, I need to go on a binger of medicine work to get there, then I'm not recommending that, but for some people, that's their way. For some people, it's experience recreational work. And that's what leads them into the deeper parts of it. I hear stories all the time. I was like, well, I did mushrooms in college, but I'm interested in doing plant medicine because it's kind of the thing right now. And I get it. But I think it's calling us to a deeper place that is going to move beyond this. This is the conversation in the Renaissance that I really want to have with people. It's like, what do we do afterwards? We've been talking about the Renaissance coming and coming and coming. It's here, guys. What are we doing after this? What are the systems in place? How do we operate as individuals, as a subjective individual, in an objective community or society? What's coming after this? That's the conversation that I want to have. Because I think we are the medicine. In my framework, I'm an energetic, resonating transmitter receiver of electromagnetic energy. Thoughts are electric, feelings are magnetic. When I change my thinking, I change my point of attraction. That goes out into the field. It affects everybody in my field. Sort of like the butterfly effect, right? I firmly believe that. Like, the more I step into servitude, the more I actually get. When I surrender to that place of being of service and of constantly being of service, I get more than I can contain. I have to give more away because I just can't hold it all. And it doesn't always show up in dollar signs. And that's okay. So hopefully that's a little bit not too convoluted, but deeper.
I really liked that
Okay.
deeper layer and the subtleties. To
Yeah.
it. There's a lot there.
Yeah, like when we do some of the medicine work with my teacher, we will work with very, very small doses. You have to lean forward much, much more into the experience than leaning back and go like, okay, do something. Like, what's next? It's like, how about if you lean forward and you take some responsibility and agency and start to kind of shine the light in your own corners to see what's there. Like also being reserved into jumping to creating a meaning around it. So, thank you.
And then on that note, what are your thoughts on just like daily consistent sub-perceptible microdoses? So like, 0.1 grams of psilocybin in the morning or less than that.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of bounced around with doing microdosing protocols for myself and using different substances. A plant called Kana, which is from South Africa, that is also psychotropic, but in smaller doses is I guess you would call it an analgesic. It just kind of takes the edge off of things and kind of brings you back into kind of a state of connection. So I was using that for a while and just kind of brewing it as a tea at night. Had, really great lucid dreaming. Definitely kind of walked around with my heart open, to like more than usual, I guess. Yeah. But again, I think it's more about the practices than substances. Finding different ways that you can develop touchstones in your day that keep you like on a keel, like, because I kind of see our life experience as sort of like a sine wave with big peaks and valleys, right? And we call those peaks like high vibes, and we call those low valley, dark energy or dense energy. And we find ourselves someplace within that throughout our day. And so managing that wave becomes like really, really important. Because I think if we default to a state of well-being, then that's where we show up, right? So when the shit hits the fan or things are going crazy, like your mind's quiet because you've been paying it forward this whole time in your practices to maintain that keel, if that makes sense. So you're not as affected. It's like, a Matrix moment where the bullets just kind of slide by you and you just kind of get out of the way. You're not as reactive to things. You're a little bit, slow to anger. You don't jump to conclusions. Things get a little bit quieter. At least that's the way it's felt for me.
Thank you, audience, for that fun dialogue. I appreciate the engagement. And I want to close out and say thanks, Andy, for sharing your voice.
Thanks,
See you
everybody.
all.
Thank you.